Ambassador BULUS LOLO. Let's consider the foreign policy environment for us. I mean, one of the commonest things we hear about Nigeria's foreign policy is the landmark statement by Nigeria's first Prime Minister, Alhaji Tafawa Balewa, when he, of course, declared what Nigeria's objective was in the foreign arena at independence. Of course, there have been shades of differences, perhaps a reinforcement over time, but you've been a custodian, as it were, of Nigeria's foreign policy. So tell us what the character of our foreign policy has been and whether there is indeed a necessity for a change at this time.
Well, thank you very much and good morning once again. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to say that the program this morning is one that has been very, very close to my heart. While I was in service in 2015, to be specific, I drew attention to the 1986 Kuru Conference on the review of Nigeria's foreign policy, which was the last time, as far as I remember, that such an exercise took place. And the Kuru Declaration at the time became a landmark reference point in looking at our foreign policy. And 2015 then was 29 years away, since Kuru. And I thought that by now, government would have organized a comprehensive review of Nigeria's foreign policy. You asked what has been the character. Indeed, no one can define foreign policy without acknowledging that it is dynamic and very fluid. And therefore, states who are the main actors, but today we have other non-state actors that have become critical in foreign policy discourse, who then impact on what we all regard as foreign policy. And for those who may wonder, what is foreign policy? Foreign policy is essentially the extension of a country's domestic policy externally, because that's the milieu where it takes place. Therefore, what happens within your country, you bring to bear externally in relation to other actors. I've already acknowledged that there are state actors and non-state actors. And indeed, the content of foreign policy is one that keeps changing with time. A review may not necessarily have to focus on the objectives of the foreign policy that, in my view, are still relevant today. Some of the principles, too, on which we build our foreign policy are also relevant. But what about those that have been affected over time? In our foreign policy principles and objectives, we do have this issue about apartheid. Apartheid is no longer with us. We have racism that has refused to die. How are we interacting with the rest of the world on these issues? So in a nutshell, looking at what we do externally and in relation to what we are doing internally should be something that we undertake from time to time. And that is why I advocated, and in fact, as recent as last month, I remember granting an interview to Leadership newspaper in which the headline to that interview was my call for a review of Nigeria's foreign policy. So I really welcome this opportunity, and much more so that NTA is also taking the lead in highlighting what the issues ought to be in a review of our foreign policy.
What are the issues he didn't agree with you, and how does that really touch on the nation's foreign policy, and what, in your opinion, should form the character of a review, as you have always advocated?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kiran, and I welcome the comments that I've heard both from Ambassador Keshi and Professor Akinteriwa, two individuals that I respect very highly. When we speak about a foreign policy review, and I want to disagree slightly with Professor Akinteriwa on this, when he says that there has always been a review. You cannot take a review by one side and equate it with a comprehensive review of Nigeria's foreign policy. I was in the service, Ambassador Keshi was my senior in the service as well, and therefore we both know and acknowledge that from time to time there is an internal discussion on Nigeria's foreign policy. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has the primary responsibility, for instance, to manage Nigeria's foreign policy. But when I advocate for a review, and let me also use that word comprehensive, it has to be comprehensive. I'm referring now to the content of our foreign policy. I'm referring to the character of our foreign policy. I'm referring to the style of our foreign policy. I'm referring to the delivery capability and capacity of our foreign policy, as well as the results. And in this, it is not going to be one person. It has to be the totality of the assets that we have. And it has to involve the three arms of government. It has to involve Nigeria's intelligentsia. It has to involve the civil society. And more fundamentally, it also has to involve that very Nigerian in whose name both the government within and its agents abroad speak on behalf of. Our Constitution says, we the people. Who are the people? Are they involved in foreign policy formulation? And therefore, necessarily, a review of foreign policy should bring together this constellation of players to come together and agree. When you talk of your national interest, what is the context of that national interest today? When you talk about implementation of foreign policy, who are the people that are implementing the foreign policy? And here I want to underscore what Ambassador Keshi said regarding the strength of your domestic policy. Only yesterday, a verdict was read in Minneapolis in the United States on a horrendous crime that was committed in the full glare of the world on TV. The murder of George Floyd, sorry. If Nigeria is endowed, as we often lay claim to and pronounce that we are the leaders of the black world, do we have the voice to speak and others will hear and respect us that indeed Nigeria is the leader of the black race? What if within our own judicial system a crime takes place that is horrendous, but the outcome is scandalous? How will anyone take you seriously? And there are many such issues in which there has to be consistency, there has to be coherence, and there has to be relevance in what we say and what we do. And this is why we must recognize as a people that the conduct of our domestic policies is as important as what we want to say abroad to be believed. And here I'm saying, can Nigeria be seen and regarded as Africa's authentic voice? Equally, can our democracy be measured as one that is inclusive, one that is accountable, one that takes care of the needs of the most vulnerable in our society? Because out there, we may find ourselves speaking about the underprivileged. We may find ourselves speaking on issues of justice and equity. How relevant are we? How believable will Nigeria be, especially if you charge your top diplomats to go and define it? And here I go back to my days in the university to recall the definition of a diplomat that my lecturer taught me. And he said a diplomat is an honest person who may find himself or herself telling lies on behalf of his government without losing face. I don't believe that diplomats are liars, but a circumstance can force you Right now in Myanmar, for instance, and Russia, there are issues that are very current. And their top diplomats, especially at the United Nations, step out in front of the TV. What we say, defending the indefensible is a painful duty, and we must not make our diplomats to go through that.
Ambassador BULUS Lolo, thank you very much there for the elaboration further still. Ambassador BULUS Lolo, there is quite a lot on the plate. I mean, you talked about content of our foreign policy, objective is character, style, and the principles on which we have built this foreign policy. As you very well know, I mean, I can mention theory in passing, but when you say principles, principles derive from theory. That's your understanding of an issue. And there are a number of issues on the table right now. You also have mentioned climate change, human trafficking, terrorism, and the whole idea of seeking to push the LGBT idea by say the U.S. and some Western countries. Do we, as a country, need to worry about these matters and therefore frame them into our foreign policy matrix so that we would know how to then respond? There are other practical issues that we will deal with in terms of being, foreign policy in action. Do we have a sufficient idea? Look, our neighbors, for instance, just how well are they doing? And we do know that a number of our neighbors, if not most of them, have linkages with other powers. Have we been able to overcome that so that some of these critical issues that we are talking about, terror, for instance, that has been around us now for well over a decade and has hobbled our security system, what is it that we need to do so that we have better foreign policy results?
Well, thank you very much, Kingsley. And first, let me say that so far, our discussion, I think, has brought out the core issues that make up the content of Nigeria's foreign policy in a way. But what may be lacking is sufficient understanding and appreciation of what we talk about when we say we are talking about our foreign policy. And this is the need I want to borrow from our own internal language, which is very common here, that we carry people along. I had said much earlier that government acts in the name of the people. As a student in the university, I recall a lecturer had set a sessional examination in political science in which he said, he asked the students, people, who the hell are the people? Now, if you ask this question, when we go out and say we are working and acting in the name and interest of Nigerians, who are we talking about? And number two, what is that interest of the Nigerians? Is it the same interest as we see internally? And that is why when we talk of the impact of foreign policy being what obtains domestically that you project externally, I will agree here with what Professor Akinteriwa is pushing, that where a country is not doing what it is expected to do, the external environment can and should influence that country to do the right thing. Take the existence of the ICC, the International Criminal Court in Geneva. Gone are the days when you can act with impunity to abuse the rights of your citizens. Why? Because in 2005, states, including Nigeria, committed to what was then defined as responsibility to protect. If a government fails to protect its own citizens, others can mobilize to come in and force that government to do the right thing. And so now, when we are talking about our foreign policy, and I talked about the content, I talked about the character, these go to bear on what? what you have in your hands, how you are managing it, and whether or not it is sufficient. I referred also much earlier that in 2016, there was a retreat that my humble self organized in Kaduna for the two committees of the National Assembly on Foreign Affairs, both the Senate and the House. And we were quite fortunate to have had a good representation from the National Assembly at that first ever retreat to look at the interface between the three managers of Nigeria's foreign policy. And who are these managers? The three arms of government bear on the management of Nigeria's foreign policy. But you find out that there is no collaboration or cooperation between these three arms. There is also no institutional arrangement to bring them regularly to interface with one another. And thirdly, a recognition of the boundary lines when it comes to role and responsibility. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the manager of Nigeria's foreign policy, cannot go and legislate on Nigeria's foreign policy. But the National Assembly, too, that makes the law, does not bear the responsibility of implementation. It is through the oversight responsibility of the National Assembly, for instance, the appropriation power of the National Assembly that can be brought to bear to make sure that when money is allocated for foreign policy management, that it is used judiciously, that it is accountable, and that it is effective. The legislature has the responsibility to interpret the law. But when the three come together in a manner that ordinary Nigerian that is asking, what do you do for me outside? You're an ambassador. I should be able to tell the Nigerian that my work as an ambassador is impacting him or her in this way or that way. Yeah. That's how it should be. And that the man on the street then, whether they can read or write or not, will understand and appreciate that an ambassador is there speaking for them. And so, all that we are saying today is create a forum where it will be open, where the presentation will be simple enough, and that indeed everyone will have the opportunity to speak, so that when you come to collect the views that are expressed, you can calibrate them and say, these are our priorities today. So that's one of the objectives of a review. Whether you call it comprehensive or not, it doesn't matter. It is what comes out of it.
All right. So from all indications, your perspectives to this conversation are all very pertinent, with respect to the issue of reviewing our foreign policy.